Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Over the next hour, in addition to taking your questions, we will delve into this fraught subject, dispel the myths, deconstruct the fictions, and reveal the truth behind these two terms. We will also analyse what frequent attempts to fudge these issues have meant for the possibility of constructive debate about Israel, for truth and clarity over events in the Middle East, and critically, for Israel's legitimacy and the security and safety of the Jewish people around the world. I'm thrilled to be joined by Michal Cotler-Wunsh, the new CEO of the International Legal Forum, an NGO based in Israel combating anti-Semitism, terrorism, and the delegitimization of Israel and the Jewish people. Prior to this, she served as Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism from 2023 to 2025. Some quiet years you had there. Her work concerned the threat of anti-Semitism in international institutions, academia, online, and on the streets. Previously, as a member of Israel's 23rd Knesset, she chaired and served on several key committees. She was the first Knesset liaison to the issue of the ICC and co-founded the Inter-Parliamentary Task Force to combat anti-Semitism online. Michal's work has focused on international law, human rights, and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. She's held strategy and policy roles at the Jewish Federations of North America, Nefesh B'Nefesh, and Reichman University in Herzliya. She also serves as a trustee for the Rabbi Sachs legacy. And Michal, that strikes me as enormously fitting when we come on to discuss this subject, because of course, Rabbi Sachs was many things, an incredible leader, a wonderful philosopher. But it was when I heard his very famous now analysis of the evolution of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus, with its contemporary focus on the Jewish state through the mechanism of international law and human rights, that it was finally clear to me how to best explain to those perhaps outside of the Jewish community why it is that anti-Zionism is indeed this modern mutation, this subset of traditional anti-Semitism. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us to talk with real expertise and experience on this subject. And after your opening remarks, I look forward to taking questions from the audience. I'll encourage our audience to start putting their questions into the Q&A facility on Zoom, and we'll come to those in due course. Michal, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you to all of your viewers that have joined us for this, what I think is one of the most pressing issues of our times. And thank you for that very, very relevant introduction, including in quoting the late Rabbi Sachs, who made very, very clear what it is that we are witness to today in explaining the mutation of anti-Semitism and ever mutating hatred, which Professor Wistra referred to as the longest hatred around for thousands of years, for as long as the Jewish people have been around, with Rabbi Sachs actually underscoring that the way that this ancient, ever mutating, lethal hate creates new viral strains, if you will, resilient strains, is actually by latching on to the guiding social construct of each time: religion, science, and the secular religion of our times, international law and human rights. And what brings us, so specifically you, Natasha, who has done so much important work in this realm, and myself, to this conversation at this pressing moment. The understanding that it is international law and human rights, if you will, the post-World War II international rules-based order that served as that guiding social construct on which that ever-mutating lethal hatred latched onto, actually enables to understand what it is that we've seen for the better part of the last 50 years of what I would term an unconventional war for public opinion. Of course, it began long before, but I would like, for the purpose of this conversation, to present with what I believe explains what it is that we're seeing in the streets today with the new, modern, mainstream strain of anti-Semitism the strain of anti-Zionism and how we would have arrived at this moment in time. And when I begin in 50-year ago, opening shot, I would call it, that actually enables to understand the systematic hijacking, redefinition, inversion, weaponization of international law, of in the international rules-based order, of the human rights infrastructure created to uphold, promote, and protect that law-based, international law-based order. I begin with the 1975 Resolution 3379 that the UN passed, the resolution that actually stipulated that Zionism is a form of racism. In order to be able to understand the atrocity of that moment, and in fact, the egregious nature of the equivalency between Zionism and racism in that 1975 resolution, I encourage actually your viewers to delve down into what at the time, not only Israel's ambassador to the UN, Chaim Herzog, said, but in fact into what the US ambassador to the UN at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, says very, very clearly, understanding precisely the moment that we are in today, in that it threatens the international rules-based order and its institutions and the mechanisms entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect those principles equally and consistently. In understanding, and as he says very clearly, that Zionism may be a lot of things, but it isn't and cannot be racism. And in order to be able to actually understand why he's so outraged, I think 50 years after, we actually can understand what we are witness to in what I would call the brown, red, green alliance. Zionism is racism, passed in the UN, actually adopts then Nazi ideology that has the Jews as a race, which everybody here likely knows, and I hope accepts, that that is exactly not what the Jewish people are. What we are is a prototypical indigenous people. Prototypical indigenous, because indigeneity too has meaning, that speak the same language Hebrew and traverse the same land Israel and read the same book, the Bible, that was so terribly desecrated on Shabbat, October the 7th of Simchat Torah, and practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. But adopting the Nazi ideology that actually had the Jews as a race, as an inferior race at that, that had to be destroyed in whole, we understand what it is that Patrick Moynihan is outraged by. I would say the intersection of that brown with the red is, of course, that it echoes Soviet propaganda. Zionism is racism that far predates. And there are scholars on this as well. Isabella Toporowski just wrote a book about this. The understanding that Zionism is racism, Soviet propaganda, is adopted in the UN in that 1975 resolution and is alive and well on university campuses, online and on streets in the name of progress today in 2025, 50 years later. And of course, the green, which we see today in the same way, the green being the then Arab states that refuse to see any Jewish presence in the Middle East. And if we look only at a map of Israel without looking at it in the context of the Middle East, then as Professor Ruth Weiss says very clearly, we do not understand a thing. The understanding that the refusal to accept any Jewish presence in this area is actually what enables the vote that passes the Zionism is racism resolution, then rescinded about 16 years later, but it mattered not, because as blood libel always does, it takes hold. So Zionism is racism, if you allow me to present as the opening shot of this unconventional war for public opinion, that after decades of conventional wars from 1948, in which we return to that ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution in a country committed to equality, that is the State of Israel and its Declaration of Independence. If you understand that from that 1948 to 1973, a series of conventional wars and in between constant violence and terror attacks, actually openly declaring the intent to destroy the State of Israel, the unconventional war for public opinion begins with the opening shot of the 1975 Resolution 3379, Zionism is racism, passed in the UN. Fast forward to the next example of this systematic hijacking and redefinition and inversion and weaponization of international law and its principles and the mechanisms created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect is the 2001 UN Durban Conference Against Racism. that those that were present in that 2001 Durban conference, including the human rights NGOs and advocates, experience that a conference against racism, alleged conference against racism, turns into what is an anti-Semitic hate fest. And what it is that they recognize is that it's their life's work, i.e. human rights, that have been in that way hijacked, redefined, inverted, and weaponized to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the state of Israel. And I say those three Ds, they're Natan Sharansky's three Ds in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, because they are critical to understand. They are the mechanism that actually enable the mutation of anti-Semitism over the thousands of years of its existence, demonize, delegitimize, apply double standards to, whether it's in international spaces, whether it's individuals, Dreyfus, barred from an equal place in society, or whether it is the Jewish nation state, the Jew among nations, if you will, barred from an equal place in the family of nations. And so that 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism then essentially leads to blood libel number 2 that has permeated the entire understanding of what we are seeing today, and that is blood libel of Israel as an apartheid state. Israel is an apartheid state, and as I say always, Israel is as imperfect as every other democracy I know, but it is not an apartheid state, and I am old enough to remember precisely what apartheid was. Israel as an apartheid state is not only a statement that is then launched into the world, but in fact it is peddled across university campuses, and I will say we are now at 24 years worth of university campuses across Canada, the US, many places in Europe, Australia, that hold what is known as Israel Apartheid Weeks, year after year after year. So if we refer back to blood libel number 1, Zionism is racism, 50 years ago, and then blood libel number 2, Israel is an apartheid state, 24 years worth of university graduates that experienced at least 3 years of their lives in what is an Israel Apartheid Week. And blood libel number 3, and from my perspective, I think the most dangerous and the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law, and that is in a post-October 7 reality, the appropriation, redefinition, inversion, weaponization of the term genocide. Genocide, we have to remember, coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family is annihilated in Auschwitz alongside crimes against humanity by Lauterpacht, to describe the atrocities of a Holocaust, too terrible to imagine, but not too terrible to have happened, for which there were no terms to describe. Genocide, that Raphael Lemkin then dedicates his entire life to the creation of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which in 1948, the State of Israel is, of course, one of the first signatories to. Genocide, hijacked, inverted, redefined, weaponized to seat the State of Israel on the docket of the accused in none other than the International Court of Justice, a court of last resort, by none other than South Africa, to accuse it of perpetrating the worst crime perpetrated by humanity, even as that Jewish nation state, the Jew among nations, Dreyfus, seated on the docket of the accused, is defending itself on 7 fronts of what is openly declared genocidal intent, not only by Hamas, that launched and waged that war on October the 7th with war crimes and crimes against humanity, atrocities of which the ear can barely contain, but of course joined by Hezbollah, and the Houthis, other proxies of the same criminal Islamic regime in Iran, from Yemen, from Lebanon, of course by the criminal Islamic regime itself, 7 fronts of an openly declared war intent to destroy in whole or in part, not only the Jewish nation state, but Jews around the world. And this is, in many, many ways, what explains the 8th front of which we are discussing this evening. The understanding that it is this 8th front, the unconventional war for public opinion that I've tried to make accessible, that actually in many ways explains what we saw then in the responses to the war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated on October the 7th. And I want to be very clear, as I said in a hearing 1 month after October the 7th in the UN called Never Again Is Now. October the 7th was an attack of barbarism on civilization. It was the Kristallnacht moment of our times. And the question that I posed at the time in the UN was, what would be the responses to the Kristallnacht moment of our times? And just a little over 2 years later, we have seen responses of silence, including in those international institutions and beyond, silence, right? Me too, unless you're a Jew. Women's organizations, children's organizations, human rights organizations, responses of denial. Denial. I always say, when I was growing up in Canada in the 80s, there was an attempt to teach Holocaust denial by two teachers, Zundel and Keegstra, that were struck down and weren't permitted to teach Holocaust denial decades after the Holocaust. Denial of October the 7th began on October the 7th, even while the barbaric savages perpetrating their atrocities were live streaming on order from Yahya Sinwar. Denial began. In many, many ways, in addition to those responses of silence, of denial, we saw responses of justification. Rape as armed resistance, if I would quote Judith Butler, whose texts I studied in law school, and responses that have attacked Jews, individuals, community centers, synagogues, schools, organizations, institutions, and not just Jews. Anybody who actually is identified or self-identified as a Zionist. Because to be the target of this lethal, mainstream, normalized, popular strain of anti-Semitism that can even win you an election in New York City as mayor, that is anti-Zionism, you need not be a Jew. You need just be a Zionist, someone who believes in Israel's very right to exist as the nation state of that prototypical indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, that state that is committed to equality. And therefore, the attacks that we have seen around the world, and we would be remiss if we did not remind ourselves, 2 Israeli diplomats were murdered on the front steps of the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., Yaron and Sarah, at the end of an AJC, a Jewish organization event to talk about peaceful paths forward, and the world didn't shake. The diplomatic world did not lower its flag to half-mast. It barely made a blip in the news. A Holocaust survivor that was marching in Boulder, Colorado for the release of 251 human beings who were abducted, whether they were dancing at a peace festival or sleeping in their beds. A Holocaust survivor marching for their release that the entire international community should have been demanding since October the 8th in egregious violation of law and of morality. A Holocaust survivor that is marching weekly in Boulder, Colorado, is murdered with an attack of Molotov cocktails on that weekly march. And the world doesn't shake. And many more such attacks, violence, vitriol, vandalism that we have seen across spaces and places. And so if we need to understand how it is indeed that not just Rabbi Sachs, but that has unfolded since his warning in the texts that he left us as his legacy, to understand what we saw in the past in the mutation of anti-Semitism and what the current strain of anti-Zionism that sees Israel, the Jew among nations, as that other in the Middle East, as that bearer of memory, not just history that he says is his story, and not just the bearer of hope that deems to be destroyed if and when terror and tyranny seeks to destroy the foundations of our shared civilization. If we are to understand this moment in time, then we have to understand how it is that we got here. We have to be able to name what it is that we saw. And in the aftermath of the Durban Conference Against Racism in 2001 that I referred to, a second thing happens, and I referred to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Well, that long democratic process that created that comprehensive and very importantly elaborate definition of anti-Semitism. And I implore that everybody that's here with us tonight read the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, including its 11 examples. Because what it is that happens as experts in international law and human rights and Holocaust, because it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that creates this definition in that long democratic process. What it enables to do is identify all strains in those 11 examples of what is an ever-mutating virus that the late Rabbi Sachs describes. It enables, and in fact was adopted by more than 40 countries, more than 1,200 entities. I know that many of our viewers this evening are here from the UK. Most of the UK's universities and many others around the world, sports teams and others, adopted the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And it is very important to make clear, you cannot identify something without defining it comprehensively, all of its strains. That's why those 11 examples of the working definition are all critical. I mentioned before the three Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Those are Natan Sharansky's three Ds that are part and parcel singularly of the IRA working definition. Without those three Ds, you cannot identify this modern, mutated, mainstream strain of anti-Semitism that we have called anti-Zionism, that denies Israel's right to exist in any borders. And therefore, that IRA working definition and the result of that long democratic process that is not only adopted, but must be implemented and utilized to identify anti-Semitism comprehensively becomes the singular most important resource. I'll share, as former special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, alongside about 35 special envoys from different countries, the US, Canada, Europe, Germany, the UK, we convened in July of 2024, and there actually endorsed, in the name of all of our governments, what's known as the Global Guidelines for Combating Anti-Semitism, once again making clear that the IRA is the single world or internationally accepted definition that is the guide to being able to identify all strains of this ever-mutating hate, including its pernicious strain of anti-Zionism. And that is, in many, many ways, what brings us to the discussion today. And, you know, over and over, I am asked, does it matter, right? Why is it that it matters that we make very clear why anti-Zionism is that modern, mutated mainstream strain? Well, you know, post-COVID, we're all sort of viral experts, and we understand that when there is a virus, it's not enough to identify and create some sort of antidote for the older strains, COVID-19, if you will, when Omicron comes around. So it is with anti-Semitism. If anti-Zionism is permitted to fester, to permeate, to be spread across international institutions, across academic spaces, online, I didn't even mention the social media platforms that have certain protected characteristics, but don't include Zionist as a protected characteristic, to which I say, I cannot, just as in the past, just shed the relevant loathed pound of flesh to be a good human being. I cannot shed my Zionist pound of flesh, if you will, in order to be a good Jew or a good human being. And therefore, what we understand very well in the aftermath of the past 2 years, in what has been not only a tsunami of anti-Semitism in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, but in the normalization of this modern strain of an ever-mutating virus, it is that anti-Zionism actually permitted, if you will, the unleashing of all the previous strains. We understand very well, again, as we do with viruses, that just because there is a new, resilient, modern strain, it doesn't mean that the old strains have died out. And so what we see across places and spaces, online, on streets, on the marches, protests, so-called pro-Palestinian protests, to which I make very clear, if they were pro-Palestinian, they would be holding up signs that say "Free Gaza from Hamas," a genocidal terror organization that in its charter is committed to the annihilation of the state of Israel and the murder of Jews, but that also uses Gazans as human shields, as sacrifices, because for that genocidal terror organization, human tragedy is the strategy. We would be seeing signs in London, in Toronto, in Berlin that say "Free Yemen from the Houthis and free Lebanon from Hezbollah," and free the people of Iran from the criminal Islamic regime in Iran that does the very same things to the people of Iran, tortures, executes, abducts. But that's not what we've seen in the 2 years plus since October the 7th. What we have seen across places and spaces, including the streets of Western democracies, is signs holding up the butcher of Tehran that say the right side of history. what we have seen is signs that say we are Hamas and globalize the Intifada. And we don't want no Jew state. We want all of 48, as the chants in the protests against every talk that I give across campuses go. And therefore, without naming anti-Zionism as the modern mainstream strain of anti-Semitism, we are not committed to combating anti-Semitism. Without using the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, singularly, not all the other definitions that have been proposed because people don't like those 3Ds, but singularly being able to identify all strains of what is an ever mutating hate, we're not really going to be able to identify the modern strain of that ever mutating hate, therefore unleashing all the previous strains as well, legitimizing them in the name of so-called progress, resistance, liberation, justice, human rights that have been systematically hijacked and redefined and inverted and weaponized, and without understanding that this is not a Jewish issue or an Israel issue or a Zionist issue. I say all the time, anti-Semitism is not the problem of Jews. In the words of the late Rabbi Sachs, anti-Semitism is the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity and freedom and the dignity of difference. Anti-Semitism was never the problem of Jews. We wouldn't dare say to the subject of any other form of hate, oh, there is a hate that targets you, you should combat it. Anti-Semitism is not the problem of Jews. It is the problem of anti-Semites and of the places and spaces that allow them to fester and spread this ever mutating hate that predicts that major threat to humanity and freedom and the dignity of difference. That is what we have seen in the past 2 years. That is what we must face together. And that is the alarm that we have to sound across real or perceived difference of geography, of politics, of religion, of denomination. Because in this shared moment, what we are facing is the attack of barbarism on civilization, on our shared civilization, openly declaring intent not only to destroy the state of Israel, not only to murder Jews around the world, but in fact, to destroy and build an alternate reality on the rubble of our shared civilization, of which none of us have the luxury of being able to assume that will remain if we cherish life and liberty that we intend to fight for.
Michal, thank you for that tour de force. There is so much that I want to pick up on, and many, many questions that have been coming in through the Q&A facility. First, though, I think it bears stressing the central nature of international law to the conversation that we are having this evening. I'm frequently speaking about very similar issues, and I get a sense that especially those from outside of the legal community, the legal fraternity, have a sense that, oh, well, not everything is about law. But through your explanation, I think we've been able to centre why it is that international law in particular is at the core of this modern subset of anti-Semitism, the acceptable face, the popular face, if you will, of anti-Semitism. And that is because it is the mechanism through which this modern hatred of the Jewish state, this anti-Zionism, is deployed. And you mentioned a number of blood libels, modern blood libels, which use legal terminology. You talked about apartheid, you talked about genocide. If we think about broader issues, occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, war crimes, breaches of international humanitarian law, and what we're seeing increasingly allegations of sexual assault and rape. In all of these legal concepts, I think we also see this other phenomenon, which you started to bring out, which is this form of projection. It is striking that in each of these cases, it is the victims of these very crimes that are being accused of perpetrating the crimes that have been committed against them. And I think you drew that out extremely powerfully with respect to genocide, but it does appear to be a pattern across the use, abuse, even weaponization of all of these legal terms and legal concepts in this fashion. And so I wanted to take the prerogative of just asking you an initial question. To what extent, given that this is all predicated on falsehoods, to what extent is that a determining factor when people ask what is the difference between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism as a modern form of anti-Semitism, the false nature of these allegations, which makes them blood libels, how is it possible to bring that to the fore and to encapsulate that as part of course, the IHRA definition is much broader, but as part of the essence of what it is that we are dealing with when we're dealing with libels, with falsehoods against the Jewish state and by extension, the Jewish people?
So I just want to make clear, meaning that's the anti-Semitism playbill, right? We understand. The anti-Semitism playbill is always actually project and blame the Jew for precisely what it is that you're going to do to the Jew or have done to the Jew. I mean, we would be remiss if we didn't actually pay attention to the fact that Jews are blamed for controlling the world, even as Qatar has poured billions and billions of dollars into universities, into journalism around the world, into sports teams, literally into real estate, including the UK. The understanding that anti-Semitism always, which again, quoting the late Rabbi Sachs, as this irrational hatred that hates the Jew, Israel being the proverbial Jew, for both what we are and what we aren't. We were rich and we were poor. We were communists and we were capitalists. We were stateless cosmopolitans, and now we have a state. The understanding that there is this element of actual projection of precisely what it is that is done that enables to not only spread the blood libel, but I always want to point out, it's not just the willingness to spread the blood libel, because it doesn't surprise me that Hamas, as I said, a genocidal terror organization that in its charter is committed to the annihilation of Israel and the murder of Jews, in Mein Kampf anti-Semitism textbooks, that internationally funded UNRWA curriculum, PA, Palestinian Authority textbooks are educating children that way. That's not really a surprise. They openly declare the intent to annihilate the state of Israel and their unwillingness to accept Israel in any borders. What is devastating was the willingness to accept the blood libel, right? You can spread a lie. You could spread a rumor, think in our individual lives. And if there is no one on the listener's side that's willing to accept it, certainly not without fact checking, then you've spread a lie and you're a liar. The thing with the pernicious nature of anti-Semitism is that the blood libel always falls on ears that are willing to accept it as truth. And that is where, once again, if we backtrack to Rabbi Sachs's explanation of the guiding social construct of the time, it's very useful. If you can explain the blood libel by latching on to that guiding social construct, religion, science, right? And the secular religion of our times, human rights, which is why precisely the hijacking of language, and you're 100% right, that it's, I mean, I've given just a few examples, but you can systematically actually begin to understand the devastating implication that all of those terms that have definitions, I say everywhere I go, you don't need to be a lawyer to understand that when something has a definition, if you change the definition, we can no longer communicate about what it is that we're talking about. Changing the definition of something in a way that Amnesty International, for example, did with regards to genocide on page, I think, 101 of its hundreds of pages of a report, and actually removing intent from the definition, right? Removing intent means that murder is the same as manslaughter. That has implications that are dire for everyone, whether you're a lawyer or not. And when I try to explain to non-lawyers why double standards are so dangerous, or selective application of principles, or in our case, invented principles are so dangerous, it is that if I say to a 3-year-old, we're going to play a game, you'll play according to the rules, and I won't, the 3-year-old will say, I'm not playing. You need not be a lawyer to understand why every law begins with definitions. And just on the tail end of this response, I do want to say, when you asked about criticism of the state of Israel, because it's an often asked question, and I implore everybody read the IRA working definition. In one of the first sentences before the example, the 11 examples, what the IRIS clearly stipulates is criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Of course it isn't. I'll add, it's precisely how democracies thrive. And anybody who's been to Israel knows that there's plenty of criticism of politicians, of policies, of decisions that are made by this government or that government. That's not what anti-Semitism is, as the IRA clearly stipulates. Criticism of the state of Israel, like criticism of any other country, that's not anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism is demonization. What is anti-Semitism is delegitimization of Israel's very right to exist. What is anti-Semitism is the application of double standards, or as we've seen in the past 2 years, as John Spencer would say, invented standards, including with regards to the laws of war, on, oh, it just happens to be the Jew among nations. And that is where Rabbi Sacks's foreboding or warning that anti-Semitism always is just the most reliable sign of what is a major threat to humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference begins to make sense, whether you're a Jew, a Zionist, living in Israel. None of that actually, or a lawyer, none of that matters when you understand that what this is basically the exposure of the strengths of our shared societies, if you will, of the foundations of democracies, as weaknesses, and their use and abuse to collapse our shared spaces, our societies, the foundations of our democracies from within. And that's what intersects with a much bigger conversation of what's ailing democracies everywhere.
Well, I'd like to focus, if I may, in the first instance, on this concept of definitions, because we've had quite a few questions that go to it. And I warn you, they're slightly longer than I would normally put, but I think that's a reflection of the more in-depth nature of our discussion in the context of this webinar. One states, I question why we still use the term anti-Semitism, especially when you look at its origin. The questioner writes, the term was coined by Wilhelm Marr, who founded the League of Anti-Semites in 1879, the first political organization in Germany created specifically to combat the alleged threat posed by Jews to German culture and society. I wasn't, in fact, aware of that, but you are nodding.
Yeah.
It was great. It's like if the official term for hatred against Black people were a word invented by the Ku Klux Klan. So I know there's been a movement towards focusing on Jew hate as opposed to anti-Semitism. Where do
So
you stand personally on that?
I'll actually answer very, very bluntly and say, because anti-Semitism is the one that has the comprehensive definition. I mentioned the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is of the word anti-Semitism. And indeed, that's absolutely true, that its origin is in fact in Nazi history. Except that anti-Semitism, I'll say, if it was the definition was for the word toaster, I would say let's use the word toaster. The fact is that the comprehensive definition that was created as a result of a very lengthy democratic process, and anyways, we've had so much pushback on that definition, including for many, many reasons internally, that the understanding that now we would go back to the drawing board in order to create a new word that would have a new definition that would hopefully be able to identify all 11 examples or all strains of this ever mutating virus. We would be remiss if we thought that we have that luxury at the moment. I believe we do not. I understand the challenge of the use of that word. And I will add, Jew hate does not summarize everything I've just said, because I've actually included Israel hate. I've actually included Zionist hate. I've actually included the hatred of anybody who believes in Israel's very right to exist as the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. Well, the IRA working definition and the fact that it's the result of a long democratic process of experts who were seated around the table and were experts not only in international law and human rights and in Holocaust studies, but on the imperative to our shared pledge of never again. That was the focus, right, of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the understanding that the atrocities that occurred in the Shoah actually demand that the international community create mechanisms to be able to prevent and in many ways to predict the possible recurrence of again and again is what's so dangerous. In that sense, I'll say the fact that we mentioned some of the terms that have been hijacked in this way and redefined and inverted: genocide, apartheid, racism. That's not just a problem for us. It's not just a problem for those of us that are targets. It's actually the problem of all of those that those original terms, concepts, were intended to protect from the recurrence of atrocities, right? Including those that suffer racism, including those that suffered under apartheid, including those that suffer currently as we speak, literal genocide in Sudan, while the international community soothes its some sort of conscience by this obsessive accusation and blood libelous I'll say, seeding of the Jew on the docket of the accused to say, oh, here it is. We've learned the lessons. So anti-Semitism, just to go back to the question, becomes the used term, certainly that I use, because it has the definition and because it enables us to identify and combat all strains of this ever mutating hate and use it as a resource across spaces and places, whether in city spaces, in universities, in unions, in sports teams, everywhere that we need to be able to educate to what anti-Semitism actually means comprehensively.
And latching on to that response, Michal, if I could include an additional question as to the use of the term scapegoating. I mean, this individual suggested it as an alternative, but I can understand the emphasis on the accepted definition being on anti-Semitism. This questioner says, throughout history, societies have repeatedly projected their anxieties and failures onto the Jews, labeling them as the embodiment of whatever was considered evil at the time. When a society is scapegoating Jews in this way, it's a sign of that society itself is disintegrating, as you've pointed out. Is this concept of scapegoating something that is particularly helpful in trying to break down for those that are less familiar with the concept of what anti-Semitism is?
I think it's absolutely important in explaining, very often at the end of my talks, people ask me, but why? Why is there anti-Semitism? And certainly scapegoating, even on an individual level, we can understand, right? It's much easier to blame the other than to blame ourselves. It's much easier to see the faults in the other. In this case, in a state or in an individual or in a community that is other than us. And Rabbi Sachs talks about otherness as something that explains anti-Semitism. I do want to add two more sort of insights over the last 2 years of traveling around the world and reflecting on that question of why. Why is there anti-Semitism? Why would a people, less than 16 million of us in the entire world, be so loathed that scapegoating or othered in situations where we understand that there are global trends and an axis of evil that then uses that scapegoating capability because there are listeners, as I said before, willing to accept the blood libel. It's not enough just to peddle a blood libel. The listener has to be able to be willing to accept it. Why would it be that anti-Semitism exists? And I would add, in addition to that othering or the scapegoating idea, two more thoughts that I want to share with in this conversation. And one is that in many ways, the Jews are the bearers of memory. We're an ancient people. We've been around for thousands of years. And what we're told, and literally are told to tell our kids year after year, including around the Seder table, including in every capacity, the word that appears the most in the Hebrew Bible is zachor, remember. And here I go back to what I said about the late Rabbi Sachs, the understanding that history is his story. Memory is mine. Now, if you are a very small people that is told you are the bearer of memory, you have no ability to forget what it is that happened, even if it happened thousands of years ago, right? Someone told me recently the reason that history repeats in rhyme is that we mostly remember what happened to 2 or 3 generations ago. Our grandparents or great grandparents are the most we remember because they told us. That's not the Jewish story. The Jewish story begins with Abraham. We read it every single week over and over and over again. And we are told that that is our memory. Now, the thing with memory is once it's yours, then when a recurrence of history, even if it's in rhyme, appears before you, you are the one that's able to say, wait a minute, I recognize this. I have been here before. We are the world's warning sign, right? That canary in the coal mine, the warning sign that the recurrence of history in rhyme is coming. That what is in this context of modern era an axis of evil, and we can say Iran and China and Russia and so on, the understanding that what we're seeing is an axis of evil that has identified the weaknesses of our shared civilization to collapse it from within, well, memory can recognize that. So you would understand why it would be really good to get rid of memory. That's one insight. The second insight is actually a lot more what I hope will be positive, and that is the notion of hope. Because the understanding that what has carried our people, as I said, less than 16 million of us in the entire world, through thousands of years of trials and tribulations, including exile and persecution, what has carried our people, and in turn we have carried, is the notion of hope. Hope is a very active virtue that the late Rabbi Sachs differentiates from optimism as a very passive virtue. Hope is the belief that together we can make things okay, as he says, as opposed to optimism, that actually is the belief that everything will be okay on its own. Hope as a virtue that requires courage, as opposed to optimism, as he says, that requires not very much courage. And hope has not only carried our people through thousands of years of exile and persecution, and in turn we have carried it, but hope is also the national anthem of the nation state to which we returned after millennia of exile and persecution that is committed to equality, that is Hatikva, the hope, literally our national anthem. And hope is also precisely what totalitarian terror and tyrannical regimes would need to quash in their attempt to do precisely what it is that they openly declare. You just have to follow Khamenei on Twitter to know what he intends to do, which is destroy not only the little devil, but the big devil, and to build that alternate reality on the rubble of a civilization. That's true for many others in this axis of evil, bound together by the one thing that unites them, that is anti-Semitism. Because if all you need to do is other, or scapegoat the other, is destroy memory, so that the hard disk, if you will, so that no one remembers and recognizes what it is that you're doing, and destroy hope of a better future, then what you see is that there will be no uprising against this tyrannical terror, totalitarian attempt to actually collapse the foundations of our democracies, to destroy, if you will, our shared civilization. So for those two additional sort of insights, I would add to the other, yes, the scapegoating of the other, but I would add memory and hope. And then I would add that hope also then becomes our call to action at this moment in time, right? Understanding that hope requires action and courage, understanding that it is what we have carried for thousands of years and has carried us in turn, and understanding that it's also what we can bring to the world, not only in remembering and reminding what it is that we're seeing in the recurrence of history in Rhine, but also in being able to be the torchbearers, if you will, of hope that there is what to do at this challenging existential moment.
So, Michal, I want to come on to a whole group of questions about what we do, how we fix this, what the solution is. But before that, there are another theme. There's another theme within the questions, which I will try and summarize as much as possible as to who it is that can be an anti-Semite or an anti-Zionist. We have the example of Hannah Einbender, the Emmy winner, saying that she feels it's her obligation as a Jewish person to distinguish Jews from the state of Israel. Questioners asking, is it not possible to be a Jew and not be a Zionist? The example of the Satmars being given by others as to whether or not they can be defined as anti-Semites. What is your view on, if you will, the Jewish anti-Zionist and perhaps anti-Semite in that respect?
So I'll say, the thing with memory is that we've been here in all kinds of ways before. We would be remiss if we did not remind ourselves, and in some ways even understand the initial thought that would say the relevant loathed pound of flesh, when religion is the guiding social construct, is my religion. So I'm a Jew. And if I wasn't a Jew, maybe I wouldn't be so loathed. So I'll shed that relevant loathed pound of flesh, if you will, in Shakespearean terms. Well, the relevant loathed pound of flesh in a 2025 reality, clearly, even as I walk into lectures in, I don't know, law schools in New York City, and on the sidewalk, in the entrance to my talk about anti-Semitism and combating it with human rights, it says Zionists not welcome. The relevant loathed pound of flesh is clearly Zionist, of which, when the first student in the protest against me says to me, I am a Jew and I hate Israel and I wish it would disappear, that 20-year-old is under the assumption, and many others, I'm not minimizing, but that 20-year-old that just wants to be able to be a part of the social equivalence of his counterparts and be invited to the party that's taking place on Saturday night is easily convinced that if he would just shed that Zionist pound of flesh, and by the way, not so easily convinced. We said this is a war. It's a war zone. It has been raging for decades. So if you accept that Zionism is racism, who walks into the room and says, hi, I'm a racist? That's how that 20-year-old perceives saying, hi, I'm a Zionist, which is what I say, hi, I'm a Zionist. In fact, the idea that, again, or once again, there are Jews who actually believe that if they just shed the relevant loathed pound of flesh, they could be good human beings or even good Jews. We've been here too before. And so that doesn't surprise me and shouldn't surprise us one bit if we remember Jewish history. What I do say, including when I'm sitting at university presidents' offices, and the university president says to me, oh, I've just received an email from a senior faculty member, he's a Jew, and he says he's an anti-Zionist, and he says he doesn't accept the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, to which I respond the following, as follows. It is that university professor's right to self-identify as whatever they choose. What is not their right is to preclude me, a self-identified Zionist, to identify as what I choose. And the majority of Jews happen to self-identify as Zionists, and many non-Jews happen to self-identify as Zionists because Zionism, a progressive national liberation movement anchored in thousands of years of yearning and prayer and longing to return to Zion and Jerusalem, didn't come out of thin air. It is that progressive national liberation movement that enabled the return of our prototypical indigenous people to our ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution. So on one hand, I'm not shocked, and we shouldn't be shocked. We have to stop being so shocked with history repeating itself in rhyme, including the way that our own people may respond or may choose to respond. And I'm not denying agency to those who are anti-Zionist because they hate Israel and wish it would disappear. What I am denying is their ability to preclude me and the majority of us who self-identify as Zionists because it's integral to our identity. I cannot just shed my Zionist pound of flesh to be a good human being. And in that sense, I think that that's what we're met with across spaces and places, including some of those that you've mentioned.
Michal, I'm going to get through as many of the questions as I possibly can and the time available. The last one on this sort of definitional aspect. The question writes, anti-Zionism is definitely against Jews and the existence of Israel, but it's also against Christians who are Zionists and believe in God's choice of the Jewish people to live in the land of Israel. Since both Jewish people and Christian Zionists are targets of anti-Semitism, what do we make of this? And of course, recently it brings to mind Tucker Carlson's comments about his not positive feelings towards Christian Zionists in particular. So how do they factor into the definition of anti-Semitism?
So here's, I mean, I guess, there's slim pickings, but I say that's my silver lining. I referred to it before. Anti-Zionism targets a much larger subset of us than I'll say traditional anti-Jew hatred, right? That's what we said before about that, what anti-Semitism has evolved, right? Anti-Zionism targets all, whether you're Christian, Jewish, religious, secular, all who believe in Israel's very right to exist as what it is, that Jewish nation state. The understanding that then there is a much larger subgroup that is able to fight this together is, for me, very hopeful. The understanding that there is this moderate majority public around the world that is silent or silenced, that is able to identify this moment because it is targeting them directly. Meaning, if in the past that good old traditional anti-Semitism only targeted the Jew, but now it targets the Zionist, i.e., you don't need to be a Jew, that means that there is a lot more of us as what I would call boots on the ground. And in many ways, and you mentioned Tucker Carlson, it takes me right back to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Everywhere that I go, I say, to me, it matters not if anti-Semitism comes from what we call the extreme right, the extreme left, the extreme Islamist, keyword being extreme. What anti-Semitism predicts is that extremism. The glue is that anti-Semitism as defined by IRA. And that definition enables me to transcend and reach across real or perceived differences of politics, of religion, of geography, of denomination, and say what I identify here is the threat of the extremes on all of us, on our shared civilization. In many, many ways, again, the IRA, and including in those spaces that say, well, will you engage with so-and-so on the what's not known the extreme right or the extreme left? And what I always say is, if those individuals are committed to combating anti-Semitism, or those political parties are committed to combating anti-Semitism, all they need to do is adopt the IRA working definition to condemn, call out, and fight against anti-Semitism in their own so-called backyard, on the extreme right, on the extreme left, in the extreme Islamists, and the understanding that there is this resource, once again, that enables to transcend politics and religion, as I said, and geography and denomination, is a very important notion that enables to, in many ways, enlarge the pool of those of us that are committed to combating this together, recognizing the threat to all of us. And that, as I said, for me is a bit of the silver lining in the allies and friends that we share around the world that understand this moment as an existential one for themselves as well.
So moving a little later than I'd hoped to a discussion of the solution to all of this. With your permission, we might run a little over to try and do justice to this section. One questioner writes, Richard Dawkins wrote the book The Selfish Gene. In one chapter, it is mentioned where he suggested that just as a gene is a unit of biological inheritance, a meme is a unit of cultural transmission or imitation. Thus, human behavior is transmitted not by biological means, but by cultural or religious imposition. My question is, wouldn't it be easier to ban such ideologies? In most countries, the books of Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are banned because Zionism is a negative meme. The same thing will need to be banned in the form of Soviet propaganda, ideas in the Muslim Brotherhood. We see radicalization amongst young people due to these dangerous memes. So there's references to, I suppose, the impact of social media there. But is there mileage in simply banning manifestations of this new form of anti-Semitism?
So I'm not a big believer in banning, but I'm not a big believer in banning across the board, meaning it's not just I'm a free speech proponent to say I'm a free speech proponent, but only the speech that I like. The understanding that banning Mein Kampf has not actually prevented the proliferation of Mein Kampf around the world, including in the dungeons and tunnels of Gaza, found below every single home and in every single tunnel, in the hundreds of kilometers of tunnels built with international humanitarian aid below hospitals, schools, homes, mosques in Gaza, is all you need to know, by the way, with international funding, as I said, right, by countries in which Mein Kampf may be banned, but in fact has enabled the reproduction of this anti-Semitic text in Arabic across the Arab-speaking world. Now, that's not to say that there aren't parameters, and as a Canadian, I always I'm able to use the free speech limits that Canada came up with in terms of harassment and fighting words and intimidation and bullying. And I'll always say, including when I was as legislator, created an interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism. I'll say a word about that in a minute because the question referred to it a little bit as well. The understanding that speech moves into conduct, and we have to be able to identify that moment where it's no longer speech, right? What we saw on campuses, literally violent vandalism, attacks, harassment, that wasn't speech. It was dubbed as speech and therefore permitted. But in many, many cases, it crossed way over into conduct. It was just not treated as conduct. So we have to be very clear on what speech is. And if we're really going to be true to the idea that, speech can be combated with more speech, then we can't actually selectively then ban and cancel. Oh, I don't know. It just so happens every Zionist professor on campus, or every student who believes in Israel's right to exist, or every department that actually taught what the Holocaust was, and with the academic rigor that we would expect. And I would argue, and I have said to many university presidents, what we have discovered, including or in addition to the billions of Qatari dollars that have bought up universities, including the understanding that what we have seen in the past 2 years is actually a moment of reckoning for academic spaces, i.e., are they institutions that are mandated to teach people how to think critically, is what I went to law school for, or are they places that are teaching people what to think, which is a very dangerous prospect? So everything that I said about free speech can only exist in a world in which we're really all playing according to the same rules. If we, again, we're back to the double standards, are applying standards selectively and saying, well, not that speech, and not that Zionist, and not that Jew, and not that professor, and not that paper, and we won't publish that, then we're not actually adhering by those principles equally and consistently. And I think that's how we've got here. Now, the one thing that I want to add, well, not one thing, but the social media piece is a huge one, because if I had to describe what we've seen in the past 2 years, it's actually the clarity, and maybe it'll lead us a little bit into the solutions as well, in the intersection between, I'll call them the battlefronts, in which the systematic hijacking, inversion, redefinition, weaponization, not just of legal principles, the international law institutions and human rights organizations, but the academic spaces that we've mentioned and the online spaces. The understanding that what we've seen actually is a system, like a closed system, where they feed off one another. So if genocide is then peddled in the online spaces, after it's been used in the International Court of Justice, after the Amnesty International report has validated its accuracy on page 101 without that intent piece, after the academics, scholars for genocide corroborate, which we know none of them are scholars, nor do they know anything about genocide, but it doesn't really matter. All of those spaces are actually creating what is this vortex that uses the same terminology in the same ways with new definitions. And in that sense, when we talk about solutions, what's missing is a strategy, right? And understanding that each of those battlefronts, as I call them, they're not a separate space. They're not just this silo in which we have to be able to identify what's happening in the academic spaces or in the human rights organizations or in the online spaces. And there's a lot to talk about the online spaces and what it's permitted. If we'll have time, we can talk a little bit more about it. But I say all the time, the business model of social media platforms, it's a business model, is not at all free speech. It's actually very expensive speech. Somebody's making a lot of money. And the business model that is polarizing and fragmentizing in order to keep engagement, to keep eyeballs, does not represent that free speech model that I referred to before, where both of us are walking through Hyde Park and you decide to listen to that gentleman standing on the soapbox and I to this one standing on the soapbox, and we both have that choice because we know that there's an algorithm that's dictating that your feed, your echo chamber looks very different than mine. It's not at all what we should be using to assume that free speech model is taking place on social media platforms. The one last word I'll say about it that I tried to make accessible, including in the hearings that after I held in Knesset with the social media platforms, we held in the US Congress and then the European Parliament, is that social media companies need to be held to account for one simple word, and it is transparency, right? Transparency of policies, transparency of implementation of policies, transparency of algorithm, the understanding that, and just recently we saw that on X, for example, the location of accounts became transparent, and we saw what a difference that made, right? Just one little tweak. And that is actually a whole new world that we have to be able to engage in a way that understands precisely what it is that this online reality, and before we even drill down on AI, that's a whole other challenge. But it emulates what we've seen in the anti-Semitism playbook, so that we actually have an edge in understanding how it is not only that viruses mutate, but how they identify the lacunae in legal language, but in this case, the algorithmic capability of actually being able to peddle online hate speech, whether by creating memes or hashtags or little, emojis that we weren't familiar with before. But anti-Semitism, as it has existed for thousands of years, enables us to actually, in many ways, predict and prevent what may be coming next in an online reality as well.
Well, it sounds like anti-Semitism being the virus, there is not yet a vaccine as such. We need to build that strategy. I just want to pose to you the last couple of questions in relation to this, solution, and then ask you to perhaps conclude more generally on what this solution might be. One questioner talks about many influential organizations, for example, UNRWA and Amnesty International, that are anti-Zionist and how that can be tackled. So that's another aspect in addition to the social media issues that you've just addressed. And then one questioner asks in particular in relation to the UK, how can we inoculate our national and international institutions from the anti-Semitism virus? So there's a definite crossover between those. And any other practical tips, which lots of people have been asking for. What can we as individuals do to combat this new phenomenon?
Well, first and foremost, we have the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. It is a resource that our legislators, our universities, our unions, our sports teams have to be held to account to utilize, meaning the fact that they've adopted it, that may be a nice first step, but if they're not implementing it or using it to actually identify and combat anti-Semitism, then again, it's not worth the paper it's written on. There is this critical resource, as I said, that many countries, more than 40, have already adopted, that many entities, more than 1,200, including in the UK, have already adopted. We need to hold fire to their feet and act in the sense of urgency that you probably can hear in my voice as what I would call boots on the ground, in holding to account the spaces and places that say the very nice words of I am committed to combating anti-Semitism. But if when you ask the question, as I have of mayors and university presidents, that's very nice, what is anti-Semitism? And then the person will look at me with sort of a blind look and say, what? And I say, well, what are you committed to combating? If you can't define something, you can't identify it. And if you can't identify it, you can't combat it. So the one thing that I will say is probably the most important resource that we already have is that IRA working definition. Now, about those specific examples, UNRWA, Amnesty, other human rights organizations, of course, with UNRWA, I mean, that's a case in and of itself. I don't want to drill down too much. But UNRWA created in sin, right? Because double standards work in all kinds of ways. Remember, UNRWA, a single refugee agency created for one single group of refugees, according to which I, and most people here, would still be considered refugees. I, the granddaughter of 850,000 Jews, ethnically cleansed from Arab lands in Iran, in my case, Iraq. Well, that one group of refugees, Palestinians, received a single refugee agency that, in an invented standard, passes down refugee status from generation to generation to generation, which is actually the negation of what the other refugee agency is meant to do, which is integrate refugees, first generation, one generation, so that there is no second generation of refugees. It doesn't exist in any other context. That's specifically UNRWA, and I'll say UNRWA that not only taught with its curriculum the thousands of barbaric savages that infiltrated and burned alive and raped and mutilated and murdered and abducted hundreds of Israelis on October the 7th with their educational curriculum, internationally funded by countries that would never be allowed to teach that Mein Kampf anti-Semitism. Not just that, but UNRWA still indoctrinates Palestinian children today with the very same curriculum funded by the international community and countries that would never be allowed, presumably, to teach that anti-Semitism in the donor countries. That's separate, almost in addition to everything else. And of course, Amnesty and the others, Human Rights Watch, right? If you want to understand the travesty of the systematic hijacking, redefinition, inversion, weaponization of human rights, Human Rights Watch is a very important case study. Its own founder, Robert Bernstein, writing a very important article, I believe in the late 80s or early 90s, in the New York Times about the rights watchdog lost in the Middle East, in many ways, just as Rabbi Sachs did, anticipating this very moment in time. And the understanding that what we are facing now, and I want to sort of end with this thought and this idea, is yes, an existential moment. And yes, this moment of reckoning across spaces and places. We've mentioned the intersection that we've seen in not only mainstreaming and normalizing this strain of anti-Semitism that is anti-Zionism, but actually in unleashing all the previous strains of anti-Semitism, this ever-mutating lethal virus. In understanding it, though, what I think is unique, certainly for our generation of Jews, is that 2025 is not 1945. Meaning, in 2025, we have a nation state to which we returned after millennia of exile and persecution. In 2025, we have the ability to watch this generation of heroes that ran towards the fire on and since October the 7th with action and courage to fight on the 7 war fronts that were raging, openly declaring the intent to destroy the state of Israel. And what we've tried to talk or drill down on in the past hour is this 8th front that requires the same action and courage once we have recognized it as a war front, that says the following. In this generation, and I'll quote another rabbi who differentiates, it's Rabbi Soloveitchik, between the covenant of fate and the covenant of destiny. In this generation, it's perhaps the first time I understood it in the last 2 years. The covenant of fate for thousands of years bound Jews together, identified or defined as a people by hate, by anti-Semitism, by this ever-mutating lethal hate we've spent the hour discussing. A covenant of fate said, we are bound together because they hate us. A covenant of destiny, that this is the first generation in thousands of years that can actually make sense of, requires to lean in to this identity of who we are as a people, because we opt in to being that people, including with all of our friends across differences of religion, of geography, of politics, of denomination, Christians and Muslims, and that understand what we are facing now is an existential moment on our shared civilization, with October the 7th, the Kristallnacht moment of our times, predicting what it is that barbarism and that shared axis of evil intends to do with the foundations of our shared democracies, of our civilization, of spaces that actually cherish life and liberty. We didn't talk about the Abraham Accords. Maybe we'll save that for another time. But the understanding that all societies that have opted and chosen life and liberty, that looks to the future and not to the past, are actually under threat right now as we speak. And in that moment, the understanding and the notion of the covenant of destiny enables us not only to lean into that identity as a people, an indigenous people return to an ancestral homeland where little more than half of us live and little less than half of us in the rest of the world, as boots on the ground, able to fight on this eighth front, but doing so alongside our allies and friends, Zionists who believe in Israel's very right to exist as what is the front lines that endangers our shared democracies, but also as what is the front lines of what can defend our shared commitment to the foundations of democracies, to the cherished principles of life and of liberty. And that's what this moment, in my view, calls for, is that moral clarity and action and courage that are hope.
Michal, I can't tell you how grateful I am for your participation, for those incredibly powerful words, which I know were extremely meaningful to our audience from some of the messages coming in, an unprecedented number of people who have stayed well beyond our hour. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled at your new appointment as CEO of the International Legal Forum and look forward to the incredibly important work that I know you will continue to do with that organisation on this very important topic. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. And I look forward, of course, to finding all the ways in which we can work together in our shared commitment to advance forward. Thank you.